So there's about three main ways to organize economic systems that we've seen historically, right? Societies have done the traditional way. Traditional economies are typically agricultural economies. And one of the main tenets of a traditional economy is that, things are done the same way they always have been done. So we would also call this in economics inertia. There's great inertia within traditional economic systems. Traditional economic systems are the oldest known economic systems. They are still used, at least in part, of Asia, Africa, and South America. In a traditional economy, if your parents are harvesting cocoa beans, you're going to be harvesting cocoa as well, right? If your parents are a cobbler, you're going to be a cobbler, right? You're going to make shoes as well. So the occupations stay in the family. In traditional economies, for the most part, you have to hunt what you eat, right? In terms of what you produce is what you consume. And in traditional economies, what we've seen for the most part is very little economic progress or development. Which leads us to our second form of organizing economic systems, which is called the command economy. A command economy is where decisions are passed down from government authority and where the government owns all of the resources. So in a command economy, the government is the one that is making the decision what and which goods and services will be produced and what prices to charge. In a command economy, the government typically also decides what methods of production to use. The government usually sets the wages for the workers. And in command economies, there's usually a large social safety net, meaning that the government provides many necessities like healthcare and education for free. So some examples of a command economy would be ancient Egypt. They didn't make those pyramids through issuing help wanted ads, right? Medieval manor life. Right? There was we all learned about this in middle school and high school. There was a king, and there was, gentry, and there was a duke, and there were barons, and there were knights, and there were, who are the guys that pledged to the knights? Squires, yeah, they're squires, and they were peasants, right? And so your lot in life was dictated from the top down in this very hierarchical fashion. Communism is also a form of a command economy, not socialism. So socialism is different. Communism and socialism are different. Don't get them confused. Communism is a command economy. Socialism is not. In terms of examples of communism, right now we only have two. So that would be Cuba and North Korea. And, there's a lot of argument about whether they're actually communists or whether they're fascists that are masquerading as communists, but that's a topic for a political science class, not an economics class. Our third type of economy is the one that we are most familiar with, which is a market economy. A market economy is one where the economic decisions are decentralized. Where private individuals own the resources, and the decisions on producing and supplying goods and services are made by businesses, not the government. And the businesses supply the goods and services based on demand. Now, when we talk about market economies, we want to talk about what is a market. A market is really any place where there's an interaction of potential buyers and sellers. Markets used to be, more easily defined things, but now because of globalization and the internet and international trade and, markets are these amorphous kind of things, right? Obviously Amazon.com is a market. When we go to Walmart, that's a market. If we went to a farmer's market, obviously that's a market, so on and so forth, right? When we also talk about markets, we're talking about private enterprises, meaning that people can own and operate their own means of production. So when we're talking about market economies, we're talking about private enterprises which are defined mostly by the fact that people, private individuals, own and operate the means of production. And when we talk about means of production, what we're talking about there is we're talking about the different resources and the different businesses. Question on the three different types of economies. Now, a lot of you might be saying, well, Dr. McCarthy, these are kind of extremes. Doesn't seem like many of the economies that we have right now fall in one of these three buckets completely. and you would be right. Gesundheit. Most of the economies in the real world are what we would call mixed. They combine elements of all three economic structures, or economic systems, rather. When we look at a spectrum, which we'll learn a lot of things in economics fall along, we have a more market-oriented end of the spectrum, and we have a more command economy end of the spectrum. And what we find is that, you know, the United States falls about somewhere over here. There are definitely countries that are more market-oriented than ours, and there's a great, well, it's not great, but there's a perfectly adequate index that's produced by the Heritage Foundation that I will show you guys in a second, and I'll provide a link in the YouTube description so that you can go and explore it on your own, which talks about the different ways that we can rank economic freedom. But again, it's a very politically laden process, so it's biased, like everything is, unfortunately. So we've got the US somewhere over here. We've got, you know, in this region, we've got, you know, European countries and Latin American countries. You know, they're pretty market-oriented, but they have a greater degree of government involvement in the economic decisions than US economies. And then over here in this end, you know, obviously in the very end here, we've got, you know, North Korea and Cuba. But, you know, somewhere around here, we've got China and Russia. Our buddies. So one of the things to remember in real-world economics is there is no such thing as an absolutely free market. So there's no such thing as a free market.
I'm sorry. Back to the command to market spectrum.
Yeah.
There's not a third point there, or it's not a triangular spectrum.
Right. Correct. Yeah. So
I find it a little bit surprising, given that in a lot of third world countries right now, you have the bottoming up of traditional economies with the market economy, like Afghanistan.
Right.
There's a problem where a big part of the Afghani system is loyalty within the tribe.
Yeah.
But that resulted in the market system was nepotism.
right. And what we also find too, and an interesting thing, and that's a great point. And because this is a great open source book, I can definitely kind of change this for next semester and, you know, kind of put my own take on it. Because you're right. And one of the other things that's been budding up is the informal economies, right? Informal economy and informal labor that kind of has evolved out of traditional economic structures that's butting its head with market-oriented structures because it's all under the table and there's no reporting to governments and so on and so forth. But you have a very good point about Afghanistan and stuff like that. That yes, there are elements of the traditional system involved, but in terms of, so this is a good example of why simplification is sometimes necessary or sometimes not, right? So it's easy to just have a spectrum that's one line, right? Where we can kind of say, this is to the left or to the right of this. Once we start to, kind of fork it out, or maybe even have, another set of dimensions in here, right? If we were to kind of think of this in a XYZ axis or something like that, right? It becomes more complicated, more difficult for us to make inferences with. So part of the balance of economics is figuring out how much can we simplify without losing the main picture. Without, so if we were doing a study specifically of, Afghanistan, I think, yeah, it would be a fault to leave out any kind of analysis of the traditional economy structure and just look at, how much is a command economy and how much market oriented. But I think writ large, when we talk about, the macroeconomic systems that we're at right now, it's mostly mixed economies that are mixtures between command and market oriented, rather than mixtures between like traditional and market oriented or traditional and command, if that makes sense. So you have a very good point. And these models could be complicated or could be broken apart, and that could, cause some greater advantages and inferences and the ability to draw conclusions about stuff. Yeah, that's a very good segue into, the fact that, all models are toy models. We have to simplify, but we want to make sure not to simplify too much. So when we talk about free markets, right, we know there's no absolutely free market, and we know that we have regulations, these things called regulations that nobody loves, that define, well, actually, let's not, that just rehashes what I said up there. So let's see, market-oriented economies tend to have fewer regulations. Ideally, so the theory goes, there's just enough regulation to maintain an even playing field for all the participants. One of the great drawbacks of heavily regulating is that it often creates or exacerbates underground economies. Underground economies, colloquially known as black markets. Where the transactions are never reported to the government, and obviously taxes are never paid on them. So there is a risk of over-regulating, which will cause a decrease in the economic progress and a decrease in the government's ability to tax and spend. Questions on 1.4? All right, so I'm gonna